In August of 2019, 16-year-old Maya Rodriguez vanished during a family hiking trip in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. She was a sophomore at Durango High School, an accomplished artist known for her detailed pencil drawings and her love of capturing natural landscapes in her sketchbooks. On August 17th, the Rodriguez family had driven to the trailhead near Silverton, planning a day hike along the Highland Mary Lakes Trail, a moderately difficult route that offered spectacular views of alpine meadows and jagged peaks. The family consisted of Maya's parents, Carlos and Teresa Rodriguez, and her younger brother, 13-year-old Diego. They had started the hike early, around 7 in the morning, hoping to reach the lakes by midday and return before the afternoon thunderstorms that were common in the high country during summer. The morning was clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. Maya had brought her sketchbook and camera, stopping frequently to photograph wildflowers and the play of light on the rocky slopes. According to her family's later statements, Maya had been in good spirits, excited about the hike, looking forward to her junior year starting in a few weeks. Around 11:30, they reached a point where the main trail branched. The right fork led to the lakes, their intended destination. The left fork was a less traveled path that wound through a boulder field toward a series of abandoned mining claims from the 1800s. Maya had asked if they could briefly explore the left path, just for 15 minutes, because she had read about old mine structures in the area and wanted to photograph them. Her parents, tired from the climb and eager to reach the lakes, said no. They told her to stay with the group. Maya had nodded, seemingly accepting the decision. The family continued on the right fork. About 20 minutes later, Teresa realized that Maya was not behind them. She called out her daughter's name, thinking Maya had fallen back to take photos. There was no response. Carlos backtracked down the trail, calling louder, beginning to feel the first stirrings of alarm. Diego ran ahead to see if Maya had somehow gotten in front of them. After 10 minutes of searching and shouting with no sign of Maya, Carlos called 911. His voice, captured in the dispatcher's recording, was strained but controlled as he explained that his daughter had disappeared from the trail. San Miguel County Search and Rescue responded within the hour. By early afternoon, teams were combing the area around the trail junction. The initial assumption was that Maya had wandered off the path, perhaps become disoriented in the boulder field, or fallen and injured herself. Search dogs were brought in and immediately picked up Maya's scent along the left fork, the path she had wanted to explore. The scent trail led the dogs nearly a mile through increasingly difficult terrain, over jumbled rocks and past stunted pines, until it reached the entrance to what appeared to be an old mining tunnel. The entrance was partially collapsed, leaving an opening perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. The dogs indicated strongly at the entrance, circling and barking, but refused to enter. Their handlers noted this behavior as unusual and concerning. A search team member equipped with headlamps and safety gear entered the tunnel to investigate. The tunnel extended back about 50 feet before becoming too unstable to proceed safely, with rotten timber supports and loose rock that shifted at the slightest touch. There was no sign of Maya inside the accessible portion, and the searcher reported that he could see no evidence the tunnel continued beyond the collapse. Nevertheless, the area was marked as thoroughly searched, and the teams expanded their grid to cover the surrounding terrain. For 5 days, the search continued with increasing desperation. Helicopters flew patterns over the rugged landscape. Experienced mountaineers checked cliffs and ravines. The main trail and all its branches were walked repeatedly. Volunteers from Durango and surrounding communities turned out by the hundreds, forming long lines that moved through the forest and meadows, looking for any trace of the missing girl. Maya's face appeared on every news broadcast in Colorado. Her parents made tearful appeals for information. Her sketchbook, left in the family's car, was photographed and shared widely, its pages filled with her detailed drawings of mountains and trees, as if the images might somehow call her back. But no trace of Maya Rodriguez was found. No article of clothing, no footprint, no broken vegetation indicating someone had passed through. The scent trail that ended at the collapsed mine tunnel was the only concrete lead, and it led nowhere. By August 25th, the active search was suspended. The official statement cited the treacherous terrain, the lack of any evidence suggesting Maya was still in the immediate area, and the grim reality that survival for more than a week in the high country without supplies was unlikely. The case was transferred to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, classified as a missing person with suspected foul play as one possibility, though there was no evidence to support any particular theory. Carlos and Teresa Rodriguez could not accept that their daughter was simply gone. They spent the fall and winter obsessively researching the area, talking to miners and historians who knew about the old tunnels, hiring private investigators to pursue any possible lead. The investigation revealed that there were hundreds of abandoned mines in the San Juan Mountains, many unmapped, many connected by tunnels that had been blasted through the rock over a century ago. Some had collapsed entirely. Others remained open, dark veins penetrating deep into the mountains, dangerous and forgotten. Maya's case joined the tragic list of people who had disappeared in Colorado's wilderness, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. The months following Maya Rodriguez's disappearance were a slow agony for everyone who had known her. Her family remained in Durango, unable to leave, unable to move forward while Maya's fate remained unknown. Carlos took a leave of absence from his job as a civil engineer. Teresa, a middle school teacher, returned to work in October, but functioned in a fog of grief and desperate hope. Diego struggled through his freshman year of high school, isolated by a tragedy that set him apart from his peers, marked as the boy whose sister had vanished. At Durango High School, Maya's empty desk in her art classroom remained untouched for weeks, a silent memorial that made everyone uncomfortable. Eventually it was filled by a new student, but Maya's artwork still hung in the hallways, her drawings of aspens and mountain peaks watching over students who had begun to forget her face. Emma Chen, Maya's best friend, organized a vigil on the 6-month anniversary of the disappearance. About 50 people gathered in the cold February evening, lighting candles and sharing memories of Maya. Emma spoke about Maya's talent, her kindness, her dreams of studying art in college, but the vigil felt hollow, a ritual performed more out of obligation than hope. By spring of 2020, as the world turned its attention to a global pandemic, Maya Rodriguez's case had faded from public consciousness. Detective Lisa Warren of the San Miguel County Sheriff's Office kept the file on her desk, reviewing it periodically, but there was nothing new to investigate. She had pursued every lead, interviewed everyone who had been in the area that day, examined every theory from abduction to accidental death. All roads led to dead ends. The Rodriguez family developed a routine of grief. Every weekend, weather permitting, Carlos would drive to the trailhead where Maya had disappeared. He would hike to the junction where she was last seen, then explore different areas, convinced that he might find something the official searches had missed. He carried a GPS unit and meticulously documented every place he looked, creating his own map of search terrain. Teresa joined him sometimes, though the hikes devastated her, each one a reminder of the last day they had been a complete family. Diego refused to go at all. He said the mountains had taken his sister, and he wanted nothing to do with them. He spent his time indoors, withdrawn, his grades declining, his future dimming along with his spirit. The pandemic lockdown in some ways made things easier for the Rodriguez family. The world's isolation mirrored their own. They did not have to explain Maya's absence to neighbors or field questions from well-meaning acquaintances. They existed in their home, in their private grief, waiting for something that never came. In June 2020, a private investigator named Robert Sanchez, whom the Rodriguez family had hired in October, delivered his final report. He had spent 8 months investigating Maya's disappearance, following up on reported sightings, checking traffic cameras, interviewing transients who frequented the area. His conclusion was stark. Maya had likely fallen into an unmapped mine shaft or cave system and perished from injuries or exposure. He recommended that the family consider holding a memorial service and beginning the process of acceptance. Carlos and Teresa read the report together in their living room. When Carlos finished, he placed it carefully on the coffee table and said quietly that he would never stop looking. Teresa said nothing, but tears ran down her face, silent and endless. As 2020 turned to 2021, the impossibility of Maya's survival became undeniable, even to her parents. A person could not live for a year in the wilderness without supplies, without shelter adequate for the harsh mountain winters, without contact with the outside world. If Maya had been alive, she would have found a way out, or searchers would have found some trace of her. The rational part of their minds understood this. But the heart is not rational, and so they continued to hope against all evidence, against all reason. In August 2021, on the 2-year anniversary of Maya's disappearance, the family held a small private ceremony at the trailhead. They placed a wooden cross with Maya's name and dates, her face smiling from a laminated photograph attached to the wood. They stood together, the three of them, diminished and hollow, and tried to say goodbye. But goodbye would not come. That same week, three experienced cavers from the Colorado Mountain Club were conducting an expedition to document unmapped cave systems in the San Juan Range. The lead caver, Jennifer Moss, had obtained permits to explore several locations that were listed in old mining records, but had never been properly surveyed. Their goal was to create detailed maps that could be used by search and rescue teams and researchers. On August 19th, they entered a cave system approximately 4 miles from where Maya Rodriguez had disappeared, though none of them were aware of the connection. The cave system Jennifer Moss and her team explored on August 19, 2021, was accessed through a narrow fissure in a cliff face, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak and barely visible even to experienced climbers. The entrance had been noted in a 1907 mining survey, but marked as unproductive and subsequently forgotten. Jennifer's team consisted of herself, a veteran caver with 20 years of experience, and two younger members, Kyle Torres and Samantha Brennan, both skilled climbers and photographers who documented cave systems for scientific study. They entered the fissure in single file, squeezing through the narrow opening and descending a steep rocky slope into a larger chamber. Their LED headlamps illuminated formations of limestone and granite, the walls glistening with moisture. The air was cold and still, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth. The main chamber was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, with several passages branching off into darkness. They began their standard mapping procedure, taking measurements, photographing the formations, and noting the characteristics of each passage. It was Samantha who first noticed something strange about the walls. She called the others over, directing her headlamp at a section of the chamber's western wall. The surface there was not natural. It had been carved, deliberately shaped by human hands. The carving was crude but unmistakable, the outline of a face, roughly 2 feet tall, etched into the limestone. The features were simplified, almost childlike, but clearly intentional. Jennifer examined the carving closely, running her gloved fingers over the grooves. The marks were fresh, or relatively so, not the ancient petroglyphs sometimes found in Colorado caves. She estimated they had been made within the last few years at most. The three cavers spread out, examining the rest of the chamber more carefully. Within minutes, Kyle called out. He had found another face carved into the eastern wall. Then Samantha found a third and a fourth. As they systematically surveyed the entire chamber, they discovered that the walls were covered with faces. Dozens of them. Some were small, barely larger than a fist. Others were massive, stretching 4 or 5 feet from crown to chin. They varied in style and skill, but all were recognizably human faces, staring out from the stone with empty eyes. The cavers stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, their light sweeping over the multitude of carved faces surrounding them. The effect was deeply unsettling, as if they were being watched by a silent crowd frozen in stone. Jennifer said quietly that they needed to document this thoroughly and report it to authorities. This was either an important archaeological find or evidence of someone spending significant time in a remote cave, which raised questions about why and who. They spent the next 2 hours photographing every carved face, taking measurements, creating a detailed map of the chamber. It was during this documentation process that Kyle noticed something that made him stop abruptly. He called Jennifer over, his voice tight with an emotion he could not quite name. He directed his headlamp at one of the larger carvings on the northern wall, about 6 feet off the ground. The face was more detailed than most of the others, the features more carefully rendered. And Kyle, who had followed the Maya Rodriguez case 2 years earlier because his cousin had been part of the search and rescue team, recognized those features. The carved face bore an unmistakable resemblance to the missing girl whose photograph had been plastered across Colorado news outlets. The same high cheekbones, the same straight nose, the same slightly pointed chin. Even carved in rough stone, the likeness was clear. Jennifer and Samantha looked at the carving, then at each other. Samantha pulled out her phone, which had no signal but contained downloaded files, and found a saved news article about Maya's disappearance. She held the photograph up next to the carved face. The similarity was not perfect, but it was too close to be coincidence. Jennifer made the decision immediately. They were leaving the cave and contacting law enforcement. If there was any chance that this carving was connected to Maya Rodriguez, if there was any possibility that she had been here, or that someone who knew what happened to her had been here, it needed to be investigated immediately. The three cavers exited the cave system and hiked to the nearest point where Jennifer's satellite phone could get a signal. She called the San Miguel County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with whoever was handling the Rodriguez case. She was transferred to Detective Lisa Warren, who listened to Jennifer's description with growing intensity. Detective Warren asked several clarifying questions about the location, the nature of the carvings, and the specific face that resembled Maya. When the call ended, she sat at her desk for a long moment, staring at the file that had been closed but never forgotten. Then she began making calls. By late afternoon of August 19th, a multi-agency team had been assembled. Detective Warren coordinated with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the National Park Service, and a specialized cave rescue unit from Colorado Search and Rescue. The team also included a forensic archaeologist, Dr. Nathan Pierce, who specialized in interpreting markings and carvings in stone, and a criminal profiler, Agent Michelle Cordero, who had worked on several missing persons cases in wilderness areas. The group met at the San Miguel County Sheriff's Office, where Jennifer Moss provided detailed directions to the cave system and shared the photographs her team had taken. When Detective Warren displayed the images on a large screen, the room fell silent. The walls covered in carved faces created an eerie gallery, and the face resembling Maya Rodriguez stood out even in the photographs, more detailed and carefully rendered than the others. Dr. Pierce examined the images closely. He noted that the carving style was consistent across all the faces, suggesting a single artist working over an extended period. The variation in weathering on different carvings indicated they had been made at different times, some more recently than others. The tools used appeared to be simple, probably a rock or metal implement, wielded with persistence rather than skill. Agent Cordero studied the images from a behavioral perspective. She noted the obsessive quality of the work, the repetition, the focus on faces to the exclusion of any other imagery. She said this pattern suggested someone who was isolated, possibly mentally disturbed, and fixated on human connection or identity. The repeated carving of faces might represent an attempt to preserve memory, to create company in isolation, or to work through trauma. The question of whether Maya Rodriguez might still be alive in or near the cave was raised immediately. 2 years was an impossible time frame for survival without external support. But if there was even a fraction of a chance, speed was essential. The team mobilized to enter the cave at first light the following morning. That evening, Detective Warren made the difficult decision to contact Carlos and Teresa Rodriguez. She drove to their home personally, not wanting to deliver this information over the phone. When she explained what had been found, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Carlos insisted on joining the cave expedition. Teresa sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, afraid to hope and unable not to. Detective Warren explained gently that the cave exploration needed to be conducted by professionals first, that the environment was dangerous and potentially a crime scene. But she promised that the moment it was safe and appropriate, they would be informed of everything found. Carlos nodded, his jaw set, accepting the logic but hating it. That night, neither parent slept. At dawn on August 20th, the team assembled at the trailhead. The hike to the cave entrance took 3 hours through difficult terrain. Jennifer Moss guided them, marking the route carefully. When they reached the fissure entrance, the cave rescue specialists assessed the stability and determined it was safe to proceed with proper precautions. The team entered in stages. First, the cave rescue specialists secured ropes and lighting. Then Detective Warren, Agent Cordero, and Dr. Pierce descended into the main chamber. Even prepared by the photographs, the reality of standing in a room surrounded by dozens of carved faces was profoundly disturbing. The hollow eyes seemed to follow movement. The chamber felt less like a natural formation and more like a shrine or a prison. Dr. Pierce began a detailed examination of the carvings, while the rest of the team explored the passages leading off from the main chamber. There were 5 distinct passages, each requiring crawling or stooping to navigate. The first 3 were short, dead-ending after 20 or 30 feet. The fourth was longer, descending steeply, and showed signs of recent use. Disturbed sediment, marks on the walls where someone had braced themselves during passage. The team followed this passage carefully. After approximately 60 feet, it opened into a smaller secondary chamber, and it was here that they found clear evidence of habitation. In one corner was a crude bed made of pine boughs and what appeared to be shredded fabric. A small alcove in the wall held a collection of items, empty food wrappers, all from energy bars and trail mix, brands that were commercially available, meaning someone had brought supplies in from outside. There was a dented metal cup, a small camping stove with an empty fuel canister, and most significantly, a large plastic water jug, empty but relatively clean. Someone had been living in this cave, or at least spending significant time here. The team documented everything methodically, taking photographs and collecting items for evidence. In another corner of the chamber, they found a pile of stones, each one roughly the weight and shape suitable for carving. Next to this pile was a crude tool, a piece of metal that might have once been part of mining equipment, sharpened on one end. This was almost certainly what had been used to create the faces in the main chamber. But there was no sign of anyone currently present. The cave was empty of life. The search continued deeper. A narrow passage at the back of the secondary chamber led to a third, smaller space. This chamber was different. The walls here were covered not with faces but with words, carved in the same crude style but covering every available surface. The words were fragmented, often incomplete, as if the person carving them had been working from a failing memory or a fragmenting mind. The carved words in the third chamber created a text that was both haunting and incoherent, a stream of consciousness etched into stone. Detective Warren and Dr. Pierce documented every visible carving, photographing the walls systematically. Some phrases were clear: "I am still here," "Don't forget me," "Can't find the way out." The faces remember. Others were fragmentary or nonsensical. "Dark days count wrong," "Stone keeps time," "Am I Maya?" This last phrase, carved large and deep near the center of the northern wall, stopped everyone in the team. Ushinaj Cordero stood before it, shining her light directly on the letters. The question suggested both identity, confusion, and an attempt to hold on to a sense of self. If these carvings had been made by Maya Rodriguez, they painted a picture of someone fighting against the erasure of memory and identity during prolonged isolation. But the question remained, where was the person who had made these carvings? The cave appeared abandoned. The supplies were depleted. The most recent carvings, based on the lack of any dust or weathering in the grooves, were probably weeks old at most. But there was no way to be more precise without laboratory analysis. The team searched every passage, every crack, every possible space where someone might be hiding or trapped. They called out Maya's name repeatedly, the sound echoing strangely in the stone chambers. There was no response. In a narrow crevice off the third chamber, barely wide enough to squeeze through, they found one final space. It was tiny, more of a niche than a chamber, perhaps 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. And here they found something that confirmed their worst fears and strangest hopes. Lying in the niche was a human form, curled into a fetal position, covered partially by a thin, tattered emergency blanket. The form was motionless. The skin visible on the hands and face was grayish and drawn tight over bones. For a terrible moment, the team assumed they had found a body, that Maya Rodriguez had survived in this cave for some impossible length of time before finally succumbing. But then one of the cave rescue specialists, a paramedic named James Whitfield, noticed something. He moved closer, knelt down, and carefully placed his fingers against the figure's neck, searching for a pulse. The seconds stretched out in silence. Then James looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief, and said the words that no one expected. "She's alive." The team exploded into controlled chaos. James immediately began assessing vital signs while another team member radioed for medical evacuation. The figure's pulse was extremely weak and slow, barely detectable. Breathing was shallow and infrequent. Body temperature was far below normal. The person was in a state of profound hypothermia and starvation, on the very edge of death, but undeniably alive. They could not move her immediately. The passage back to the main chamber was too narrow for a standard stretcher, and her condition was too fragile for rough handling. James started an IV, administering warm fluids slowly, wrapping her in additional thermal blankets brought by the team. They needed to stabilize her as much as possible before attempting extraction. While the medical team worked, Detective Warren carefully examined the niche. There was evidence of long-term habitation here as well. More pine boughs arranged as a bed, a small collection of stones arranged in careful patterns, and carved into the wall above where the figure lay, one final face. This one was the most detailed of all, the features rendered with as much skill as the crude tools and stone surface allowed, and it was unmistakably a self-portrait. The face carved into the stone was the same face that lay below it, emaciated and near death. Maya Rodriguez had carved her own image into the cave wall, a final assertion of identity, a message to herself or to whoever might find her. I was here. I existed. I am Maya. The extraction took 4 hours. The team had to widen the narrow passage slightly, carefully removing stone to allow the stretcher to pass. Every movement was deliberate, every step coordinated to avoid jolting the critically fragile patient. When they finally brought the stretcher into the main chamber with its surrounding carved faces, the symbolic weight of the moment was lost on no one. This girl had spent unknown months, possibly more than a year, in isolation in these caves, creating a gallery of faces to keep herself company, to remember what human beings look like, to maintain her grip on identity and sanity. The hike out of the cave and down to the trailhead where a medical helicopter was waiting took another 3 hours. James Whitfield stayed with the patient the entire time, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting the IV, doing everything possible to keep her alive. Her condition remained critical but stable, her body somehow maintaining the minimal functions necessary for life, despite starvation and extreme conditions that should have killed her. The helicopter transported the patient directly to Mercy Regional Medical Center in Durango, where a trauma team had been assembled and briefed on the extraordinary circumstances. When the stretcher was wheeled into the emergency department, the medical staff found themselves facing a case unlike anything in their training. The patient was female, appeared to be in her late teens, and was in severe multi-system failure. Her body weight was estimated at less than 80 pounds, consistent with extreme long-term starvation. Her muscle mass had atrophied almost completely. Her skin was pale and papery, covered in areas with dirt and mineral deposits from the cave. Her hair was long, matted, and tangled. Her fingernails were broken and worn down, consistent with prolonged contact with stone. But she was breathing, her heart was beating, and that meant she could potentially be saved. Dr. Rachel Simmons, the emergency physician on duty, immediately noted that the patient's vital signs were profoundly abnormal. Heart rate was approximately 30 beats per minute, far below normal. Body temperature was 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Blood pressure was barely detectable. Respiration was perhaps 4 breaths per minute. These were not values consistent with normal life, yet the patient persisted. Blood tests would later reveal severe anemia, electrolyte imbalances, and deficiencies in virtually every essential nutrient. Her kidneys were on the verge of failure. Her liver function was critically impaired. By all conventional medical understandings, she should not have been alive. While the medical team worked to stabilize the patient, Detective Warren contacted Carlos and Teresa Rodriguez. She told them that a young woman had been found in a cave system, alive but in critical condition, and that there was reason to believe it might be their daughter. The Rodriguez family arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes, rushing into the emergency department and being directed to a private waiting room. They were not allowed to see the patient yet, as the medical team was still working, but a social worker stayed with them, providing updates every few minutes. In the emergency room, the patient's identity needed to be confirmed. Her face, though drastically changed by starvation and hardship, bore resemblance to Maya Rodriguez's photographs. More definitively, Dr. Simmons noticed a small scar on the patient's left forearm, a distinctive mark shaped like a crescent moon. When Detective Warren checked Maya's medical records, she found notation of that exact scar. the result of a childhood accident involving a bicycle fall. Dental records would provide final confirmation, but there was little doubt. The young woman fighting for life in the trauma bay was Maya Rodriguez, missing for 2 years, found impossibly alive in a cave system miles from where she had disappeared. The medical team moved Maya to intensive care, where she was placed on supportive care with the goal of gradually bringing her body back to functional levels. Simmons consulted with specialists in hypothermia, starvation, and extreme survival cases. The consensus was that Maya had entered a state of extreme metabolic slowdown, similar to hibernation. Her body functions reduced to the absolute minimum necessary to maintain life. This had allowed her to survive on minimal calories and in cold conditions that would normally be fatal. But how she had achieved this state, whether through deliberate physiological adaptation or through some accident of her particular biology, remained unclear. Carlos and Teresa Rodriguez were allowed to see their daughter after she had been stabilized and moved to the ICU. The moment was overwhelming. Teresa collapsed when she saw Maya, the recognition immediate despite the drastic changes. Carlos stood at the bedside, gripping the rail, tears streaming down his face, repeating his daughter's name like a prayer. Maya did not respond. She lay motionless, eyes closed, her breathing assisted by supplemental oxygen, her body connected to monitors and IVs. The doctors explained that she was not in a coma, but in a state of profound dissociation, her consciousness suppressed, possibly as a protective mechanism against the trauma she had endured. Whether she would wake and what her mental state would be if she did remained unknown. For 3 days, Maya remained in this twilight state. Her family maintained a constant presence, taking turns sitting beside her, talking to her, playing music, surrounding her with the sounds and presences of the people who loved her. Diego, her younger brother, now 15, sat holding her hand and apologizing repeatedly, though he had nothing to apologize for. He told her about the 2 years she had missed, about how much he had missed her, about how empty the house had been without her. On the 4th day, August 24th, Maya opened her eyes. A nurse named Patricia Sandoval was adjusting her IV when she noticed the change. Maya's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking and unfocused. Patricia immediately called for Dr. Simmons and notified the family. Within minutes, Carlos, Teresa, and Diego were in the room, standing around the bed, speaking Maya's name softly. Maya's eyes moved slightly, tracking toward the sound. Her lips parted as if trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Dr. Simmons conducted a neurological assessment, checking pupil response, asking Maya to follow simple commands. The responses were weak but present. Maya could track movement with her eyes. She could squeeze a hand when asked, though the pressure was barely perceptible. She was present, conscious, but locked inside herself, unable or unwilling to fully engage with the world around her. Maya's emergence from her dissociative state was agonizingly slow. In the first weeks, she remained largely nonverbal, communicating only through slight movements and occasional eye contact. Her body, ravaged by 2 years of inadequate nutrition in extreme conditions, required extensive medical intervention to restore basic function. Nutritionists carefully planned her refeeding, starting with tiny amounts of easily digestible foods and gradually increasing as her digestive system reawakened. Physical therapists worked with her multiple times daily, helping her regain muscle strength and coordination. She could not sit up unassisted initially. Walking was far beyond her capability. Everything had to be relearned from the most fundamental level. The psychiatric team, led by Dr. Elena Morrison, a specialist in trauma and dissociative disorders, began working with Maya as soon as she was medically stable enough for sessions. Dr. Morrison explained to the Rodriguez family that Maya had endured prolonged extreme isolation, which was among the most severe psychological traumas possible. The human mind was not designed for such extended solitary confinement, especially in darkness and silence. The effects on cognition, memory, and personality could be profound and permanent. In early sessions, Morrison simply sat with Maya, creating a safe, non-demanding presence. She spoke softly about neutral topics, describing the weather, the hospital, the city outside. She did not ask questions or request responses. The goal was to establish that interaction was safe, that the world contained more than the stone silence Maya had known for so long. Gradually, Maya began to show signs of engagement. She made eye contact more frequently. She nodded or shook her head in response to yes or no questions. By mid-September, nearly a month after her rescue, she spoke her first word. Teresa had been sitting with her, describing memories from Maya's childhood, when Maya suddenly whispered something. Teresa leaned closer, asking her to repeat it. The word came again, soft but clear. Dark. It was a beginning. Over the following weeks, Maya's vocabulary expanded slowly. She said cave. She said alone ish on. She said faces. And when she said this word, her eyes filled with tears that she seemed too exhausted to shed. The words came in isolation at first, unconnected, as if Maya was relearning language piece by piece. But gradually sentences formed, short, fragmentary, but sentences nonetheless. Dr. Morrison began to ask gentle, open-ended questions about Maya's experience. The responses were often confusing, non-linear, but they provided glimpses into what Maya had endured. She spoke about falling, about darkness, about being unable to find her way out. She spoke about hunger that had been overwhelming at first, then gradually faded into a numb constant. She spoke about cold that had seeped into her bones and never left. Most disturbingly, she spoke about forgetting. She said she had forgotten words, forgotten names, forgotten what people look like. She said she had carved faces in the stone to remember, working by touch in the darkness, creating images she could not see. She said she had carved her own face last, when she felt it slipping away, when she could not remember what Maya meant. By October, Maya had progressed enough to be transferred from intensive care to a specialized rehabilitation facility. She could sit up with minimal assistance. She could eat soft foods independently. She could hold basic conversations, though her attention span remained limited and she fatigued quickly. Physical recovery, while slow, followed a generally positive trajectory. Mental and emotional recovery was far more complicated. Maya experienced severe dissociative episodes where she would become non-responsive, her eyes distant, as if her mind had returned to the cave. She had nightmares when she slept, waking screaming about darkness and being trapped. She was intensely uncomfortable in small spaces and insisted on keeping lights on constantly, unable to tolerate even dim illumination. Dr. Morrison explained that Maya's sense of time and causality had been severely disrupted. Her memories of the 2 years in the cave were fragmented and unreliable. She could not construct a clear narrative of events. Some periods seemed to her to have lasted days, others impossibly long. She described time stretching and compressing, becoming meaningless in the absence of day and night, of any external markers. Her family supported her with unwavering dedication, but the process was heartbreaking. The Maya who had emerged from the cave was not the same person who had disappeared. Her personality was different, quieter, more withdrawn. Her interests had changed. She showed no desire to draw or create art, the passion that had defined her before. When offered a sketchbook, she had recoiled, the blank pages seeming to disturb her in ways her family could not understand. Diego struggled particularly with the change in his sister. He had hoped that when Maya was found, everything would return to normal. Instead, he had gained back a stranger who wore his sister's face but seemed fundamentally altered. He felt guilty for this reaction and tried to hide it, but Dr. Morrison gently explained that his feelings were valid, that he was also a victim of the trauma that had fractured their family. As Maya's cognitive function improved through the fall of 2021, she began to provide more coherent information about what had happened to her. In therapy sessions with Dr. Morrison, and later in carefully conducted interviews with Detective Warren, a picture emerged of her ordeal, though many pieces remained unclear and some might never be recovered. Maya remembered the day she disappeared with reasonable clarity. She had wanted to explore the side trail toward the old mines. When her family continued toward the lakes, she had made a decision that she knew was wrong. She had turned back and taken the left fork alone, planning to look for just 10 minutes before catching up to her family. She had justified this to herself as a small rebellion, a brief moment of independence. She had walked through the boulder field, photographing interesting rock formations, following what appeared to be an old mining trail. She had found an entrance to a tunnel, partially collapsed but accessible. Her curiosity as an artist and a teenager had overridden caution. She had entered the tunnel to see what was inside, to perhaps photograph the old timber supports in abandoned equipment. She had not gone far, perhaps 30 or 40 feet, when she heard a sound behind her. She turned and saw that rocks had shifted, partially blocking the entrance. She hurried back toward the light, but as she approached, more rocks fell, a cascade of stone that filled the opening and plunged her into complete darkness. She remembered screaming, remembered digging at the rocks with her hands, remembered the panic that had been like drowning in air. She had worked at the collapse for hours, or what felt like hours, until her fingers were bloody, and she accepted that she could not move the rocks alone. She had called for help until her voice was gone, hoping her family would hear, hoping someone would come. No one came. Maya's account of the early days in the cave was vague. She remembered trying to find another exit, feeling her way through darkness so complete that it was physical, a pressure against her eyes. She remembered discovering that the tunnel connected to a larger cave system, that there were multiple chambers and passages. She explored by touch, trying to map the space mentally, but disorientation and fear made this impossible. She became lost in the dark, unable to find even the collapsed entrance again. She remembered thirst more than hunger at first. She had found water by accident, hearing the drip and following the sound, learning to position her mouth under tiny flows that seeped from cracks in the stone. The water was minerally and cold, but it kept her alive. Food was more problematic. She had nothing. She tried to ignore the hunger, but it became overwhelming. She described finding insects by touch, cave crickets, and beetles, and forcing herself to eat them despite her revulsion. It was barely enough, but it was something. Her memory of time became unreliable fairly quickly. She tried to keep track by sleeping and waking, assuming each cycle was roughly a day, but without any external cues, her circadian rhythm deteriorated. Sleep became irregular. Waking and sleeping blurred together. She lost count of days, then lost the concept of counting entirely. At some point, she had found tools left by long-ago miners, a piece of metal, some rotted rope. She had taught herself to carve into the stone walls, working entirely by touch. She could not see what she was creating, but the act of carving gave her something to do, a purpose that kept her mind from completely fracturing. She carved faces because faces meant people, meant connection, meant she was not completely alone. She carved dozens of them, covering the walls of the main chamber where she spent most of her time. She told Dr. Morrison that the faces became real to her after a while. She would talk to them, touch them, imagine they were responding. They became her companions, her family, her entire social world. She named some of them, though she could not remember the names now. The psychiatrist noted that this creation of imagined social structure had likely been a critical survival mechanism, protecting Maya from the complete isolation that could have driven her into catatonia or death. As months passed, Maya's physical condition deteriorated. She described weakness, cold that she could never escape, pain in her joints and muscles. She spent increasing amounts of time lying still, conserving energy. She began to sleep for longer periods, days at a time perhaps, though she had no way to measure. Her thoughts slowed, memories faded. She could not remember her name for certain periods, could not remember what the world outside the cave was like. She had carved words in the walls, trying to hold on to language, but the words themselves began to lose meaning. She said that toward the end, she could not remember what Maya was. The word existed in the carvings, but it was just marks in stone, divorced from any referent. She had carved, "Am I Maya?" because the question was all that remained. She had no answer. As Maya's physical and cognitive recovery progressed, the medical team became increasingly focused on a question that had no clear answer. How had she survived? 2 years in a cave with no food supply beyond insects, no adequate warmth, no light, no human contact should have been fatal within weeks at most. Yet Maya had not only survived, but had remained conscious and functional enough to create extensive carvings for a significant portion of that time. Doris Simmons collaborated with researchers from the University of Colorado's medical school to study Maya's case. With the family's permission, Michigan, they conducted extensive testing, looking for physiological factors that might explain her survival. The findings were remarkable. Maya's metabolism had undergone changes that persisted even months after her rescue. Her basal metabolic rate was significantly lower than normal, her body having adapted to function on minimal caloric intake. Her muscle tissue showed unusual characteristics, retaining strength despite atrophy, suggesting some mechanism for preserving critical functions while other systems shut down. Most intriguing were findings related to her neurological function. Brain scans showed activity patterns that differed from typical profiles, with certain regions associated with time perception and memory showing reduced activity even when Maya was fully conscious. Dr. Angela Martinez, a neurologist consulted on the case, theorized that Maya's brain had adapted to the sensory deprivation by essentially turning down non-critical functions, conserving energy, and protecting core processes at the expense of normal cognition. The research team published a case study in a medical journal, detailing Maya's survival while protecting her identity. The paper suggested that human physiological plasticity in response to extreme environments might be greater than previously understood, that given certain conditions and possibly certain genetic predispositions, the body could enter states of profound adaptation that allowed for survival in otherwise fatal circumstances. But science could not fully explain everything about Maya's case. The timeline remained problematic. Even with metabolic adaptation, 2 years was far beyond documented cases of survival in similar conditions. Some researchers quietly wondered if Maya's own account of time might be inaccurate, if perhaps she had been in the cave for less time than believed, her disrupted time sense making days seem like months. But the evidence argued against this. The extent of her physical deterioration, the growth of her hair and nails, the weathering patterns on the carvings in the cave, all supported a timeline of many months at minimum. Detective Warren, meanwhile, focused on a different question. Why had Maya never been found during the initial search? The cave system where she had been discovered was approximately 4 miles from the trail junction where she had last been seen, far outside the initial search radius. But more troubling was that the collapsed mine tunnel entrance, where search dogs had indicated her scent, had no apparent connection to the cave system where she was found. Detective Warren organized a comprehensive survey of the area, bringing in geologists and cavers to map all known and suspected underground spaces. What they discovered was a complex network of natural caves and man-made mine tunnels that interconnected in ways not previously documented. The collapsed tunnel where Maya had initially been entrapped did connect, through a series of narrow passages, to the larger cave system. A person could theoretically travel from one to the other, though the route was circuitous and extremely difficult. This explained how Maya had ended up so far from her initial position. She had not fallen into the cave system directly, but had accessed it through the mine tunnel, then become lost in the labyrinth of connected passages. It also explained why the initial search had not found her. The search teams had correctly identified that Maya's scent led to the mine tunnel, but they had assessed the tunnel as too unstable and limited to continue farther. They had not known about the connections deeper in, and even if they had, the passages were so narrow and dangerous that a full search would have required specialized equipment and training. Maya had been tantalizingly close to the searchers, separated only by stone and the unlucky geography of the cave system. The realization was devastating to the search and rescue teams who had worked on Maya's case. They had done everything correctly according to their training and experience, yet it had not been enough. Detective Warren assured them that there was no failure, that some situations simply exceeded the capabilities of even the best efforts. But the knowledge that Maya had been suffering in the darkness while rescuers searched above was a weight that many of them would carry. By early 2022, nearly 6 months after her rescue, Maya had recovered enough to leave the rehabilitation facility. She moved back home with her family into a house that had been modified to accommodate her needs. Her bedroom was on the ground floor now, with large windows that allowed maximum natural light. Nightlights were positioned throughout the house, ensuring that Maya would never encounter complete darkness. Her room had been redecorated in bright, warm colors, a stark contrast to the stone gray that had surrounded her for 2 years. The transition to home was difficult, Maya struggled with the noise and bustle of normal family life after so long in silence. Conversations often overwhelmed her. The presence of multiple people in a room made her anxious. She spent much of her time in her room or in the backyard, places where she could control the level of stimulation. She continued intensive therapy with Dr. Morrison 3 times a week, working through the trauma, slowly rebuilding her sense of self. She also worked with an occupational therapist who helped her relearn daily living skills and develop coping strategies for situations that triggered her anxiety. The question of returning to school was discussed at length. Maya had missed her entire junior and senior years. She was now 18, but her education had been interrupted at the sophomore level. More significantly, her cognitive function, while improving, remained affected by her ordeal. Her memory was unreliable, her concentration limited. The family decided that traditional school was not feasible. Instead, Maya would work with a tutor at home, progressing at her own pace toward eventually taking a GED exam. Maya's relationship with her family slowly rebuilt, though it was different than before. With her parents, she was often quiet, seeming younger than her 18 years, needing reassurance and support. With Diego, now 16, the dynamic was more complex. He had matured during the years she was gone, and in some ways he had become the older sibling, protective and worried. They worked to find a new equilibrium, to become something other than the siblings they had been before her disappearance. Emma Chen, Maya's best friend, visited frequently. The friendship had been frozen in time, and both young women had changed. Emma was preparing for college, her life moving forward on a normal trajectory. Maya's life had been derailed so completely that the gap between them felt impossible to bridge. Yet they tried, spending time together in comfortable silence, occasionally talking about small things, avoiding the weight of everything that had happened. As months passed, Maya began to show interest in certain activities again. Surprisingly, she returned to art, though in a different form than before. She did not draw or sketch. Instead, she began working with clay, creating three-dimensional sculptures. The first piece she made was a face, rough and simple, the features barely defined. She made another, then another, developing a series of faces that bore a clear connection to the carvings she had made in the cave. Dr. Morrison recognized this as Maya processing her trauma, externalizing the experiences that remained too difficult to verbalize. The sculptures were exhibited at a local gallery in May 2022 as part of a show featuring work by young artists. Maya attended the opening, her first major public appearance since her rescue. She stood in the gallery, surrounded by her clay faces, as people moved around her, looking at the work, reading the brief artist's statement that mentioned only that the pieces were inspired by a period of isolation and introspection. Maya did not speak to the gallery visitors, but she watched them, observing how they interacted with her art, with the faces she had created. Afterward, she told Dr. Morrison that it had felt good to share the faces, to let other people see them and respond to them. It was a step, small but significant, toward reconnecting with the world. The criminal investigation into how Maya ended up trapped in the cave concluded that it had been a tragic accident compounded by unfortunate circumstances. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication that anyone other than Maya had been involved. She had made a poor decision to explore alone, had been extraordinarily unlucky in the rockfall that trapped her, and then had survived through a combination of physiological adaptation, mental resilience, and sheer chance. Detective Warren closed the case as accidental entrapment with no charges to file, but the case remained open in a different sense, as a reminder of how quickly a normal day could turn into an unimaginable ordeal. In June 2022, Maya and her family returned to the San Juan Mountains for the first time since her rescue. They did not go to the cave, which had been sealed by the Forest Service to prevent future accidents. Instead, they hiked to the lakes that had been their original destination that August day in 2019. They sat together by the water, looking at the peaks reflected in the still surface, and talked about many things. Maya spoke about her experience, sharing details she had not been able to express before. She told them about the loneliness, about the fear, about the moments when she had wanted to give up, but something had kept her going. She said that even in the deepest darkness, even when she had forgotten almost everything else, some part of her had remembered that people existed outside the cave, that she had a family who loved her. She said that the faces she carved were not just to remember what people look like, but to believe that connection was possible, that she was not alone in the universe. Carlos and Teresa held their daughter, this young woman who had been lost and found, who had been broken and was slowly healing. Diego sat beside them, his hand on his sister's shoulder, providing the physical connection that Maya still needed to feel grounded in reality. They stayed by the lake until sunset, watching the light change, the mountains glowing gold and then purple as the sun descended. It was the same light Maya had wanted to photograph 3 years earlier, the golden hour that had seemed so important to her teenage self. Now it meant something different. Not a moment to capture in an image, but simply a moment to be present in, a reminder that the world contained beauty and warmth, not just cold stone and darkness. Maya Rodriguez would never fully recover from her 2 years in the cave. The experience had changed her fundamentally, leaving scars both visible and invisible that would remain for the rest of her life. But she had survived. She had endured the impossible. She had carved her identity into stone and held on to it even as everything else slipped away. And now, slowly, painfully, she was building a new life, one that acknowledged the darkness she had known while choosing to walk toward the light. The faces she had carved remained in the sealed cave, dozens of them watching nothing now in the restored darkness. They were testament to a human being's refusal to be erased, to disappear completely. They were Maya's legacy to herself, proof that even in the most profound isolation, the human need for connection persists, carved deep in a stone and deeper still into the soul.